Welcome, everyone. I'm Jason Odell, if you didn't know already, and my website is Jason Odell Photography, luminescentphoto.com. And today's webinar and my webinar session is something that's kind of fun and philosophical and topics I've been thinking about for a very long time, trying to put this stuff together in my mind. So I had a fun time coming up with trying to synthesize all the information today. So with that, let me go over to my presentation and share my screen. Okay, so today I have entitled this presentation, "What Would Ansel Do?" Applying Ansel Adams' approach to photography in a digital world, and that's what's key here. Um, I'm not going to try to predict what Ansel Adams would actually do, although I have a pretty good idea of what I think he might do. So we'll talk about that. Have a fun little philosophical experience here. So in case you've been living under a rock, everybody's favorite photographer for American landscapes is usually right up there on this list is Ansel Adams, 1902 through 1984. So he had gone before I was really truly getting into photography. I was just starting to at that time. But obviously, he's one of the most well-known American photographers ever, absolute master of black and white, especially landscapes, although he did do some portraits and other kinds of photos. So not just landscapes, but very well known for photographing the national parks, especially Yosemite and Yellowstone and the parks out west. He developed the zone system, which some people may know of, which was an exposure technique. I'll go into a little bit about that and how it relates to modern photography. And he was a founding member of something called the Group F64, which is an aesthetic. They were trying to separate themselves out by having in to separate out the look of their photos from what they called the salon look, or soft kind of impressionistic painterly photos, where instead they would try to strive to get maximum depth of field, everything really sharp, hyper realistic types of photography. And the list goes on and on. I could go on that, but this is not a biography of Ansel Adams. This is a philosophical discussion. So in 1981, they published 3 books by Ansel Adams. So this was he wrote these in the period between 79 and 80, roughly. And these 3 books, the camera, the negative, and the print, are sort of an end-to-end compendium of all things black and white darkroom photography. Um, and it goes into painstaking detail in a lot of aspects of photography that are, quite honestly, unless you're shooting black and white film and developing at home, really not applicable to digital photography in the same way. But when you think about his approach to photography, starting with the camera, exposing a negative, and then producing a print, then you get this philosophy. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about today, and how we can apply this philosophy into our own digital photography. So again, we're going to talk about cameras. We're going to talk about metering, exposure, processing, a very important thing called visualization. And then I'll try to put it all together in a summary at the end on how we can approach this. Now, this photo is actually one of mine, but this may look familiar because that's the church in Bodega, California, that Ansel photographed in the 1950s. Only when he photographed it, it was a dirt road and didn't have the power lines and stuff. So same idea. So I'm going to intersperse some of his photos and some of my pictures in the presentation just for fun. So let's start off by talking about the first element, which is the camera. Now, you probably know, when you think of Ansel Adams, you think of that 8x10 view camera, that big, heavy camera on a monster tripod that he lugged around and would even shoot from a platform on the top of his station wagon. And while he's known for that, he also used a lot of other formats. And if you read his book, The Camera, he will talk about small formats, which to him was 35 millimeter, medium formats, which was things like 6x6, 645, and then larger formats, 4x5, 8 by 10. And each system had different merits for different scenarios. Now, ironically, this photo, which I captured in Denali National Park this past year, was with my iPhone. So that's a very small format camera. Whatever works, right? The point of it is that there's different pros and cons to each format. Um, and quality was only part of that. So for small format cameras, we're talking about, today's systems, we would be talking about things like micro four thirds, but Ansel was talking about 35 millimeter format. They were very easy to carry and use. They had much smaller lenses. Um, the metering systems on later ones was built in, so you didn't need to use a hand meter necessarily. And one of the things that Ansel really liked about small cameras is that you could frame things up accurately in the viewfinder. It was a right side up image. What you saw was what you could get, especially if you had a camera with 100% viewfinder coverage. Now, on the flip side, there were some things that he did not like about 35 millimeter cameras. The first thing, and this is an interesting point, is that when you had a roll of film, you had to process the entire roll of film, the negatives, at once using one type, one setting, one developed setting, whatever that was. Um, whereas, so you couldn't develop and use developing times for each negative separately. You had the whole roll. And the smaller format itself was, especially with 35 millimeter film or smaller even, you just didn't get as much detail. The grain started to present a problem if you started enlarging those images more than, say, 8 by 10. And then you had to worry about things like mirror slap if you're taking landscapes. You work around on this, but these were some cons of the format. Quality, and then not having that level of individual control. Contrast this with large format cameras. With an 8 by 10 view camera, you can get some ridiculous detail because that negative is literally 8 by 10 inches. You make a contact print, you're already at 8 by 10. So you don't need to enlarge an 8 by 10 very many times to get huge images. The lenses with bellows, you could do tricks with tilt shift. You could get things in the focal plane without having to stop down as far. And with sheets of film or even glass plates that he was using back in the 30s, you would individually process each negative. And that meant that if based on your exposure and based on the conditions, Ansel could process each negative separately. Now, I have a question about the loss of detail, if that still happens today between medium format digital cameras and 35 millimeter format. The entire landscape has shifted. So the detail in something like a 45 megapixel, 35 millimeter format camera, like a Nikon Z8, it pushes the detail of what you would have gotten from medium format film easily. And then the medium format digital cameras go way beyond that. Um, Micro Four Thirds cameras today provide as much detail as you would have, or more detail than 35 millimeter film would have ever given you back in the 70s or 80s. The downside with large format cameras obviously is they're big, and he described having to hike around and bring his backpack and his tripod, and he would hire people to carry his gear in the early days in Yosemite. And if you look at what Ansel was shooting with later in his life, it was smaller cameras. It was medium format cameras more often. He even used Hasselblads. He used Leicas. He even had a Nikon at one point. So he did have these other smaller cameras just because they were easier to carry around. The whole apparatus with a large format is slow. They're slow to set up. They're slow to use. The shutter mechanism is part of the lens in some cases. Some large format cameras didn't even have a shutter in the camera. It was you would just open and close the curtain, and that was your shutter. And larger format cameras, you get very shallow depth of field. And if you're shooting landscapes, this means you got to do some tricks. You got to stop down, hence the F64 moniker, or use the tilt lens to get more of the focal plane aligned with foreground to background. All of these things are very doable, but they definitely present some challenges in the field. And I should point out that um, all of these cameras were used by Ansel Adams and delivered wonderful images because, at the end of the day, it's still the photographer. Okay. Now, there are some features in today's camera that I think Ansel Adams would really like. I'm just guessing because, like I said, I never met the man. The closest I have in degrees of freedom was that my PhD advisor actually met Ansel Adams once when he was living in Carmel. Um, but here's some things that I think that today's cameras have that are quite nice that Ansel would really like, and that would include things like being able to focus and zoom in on your image in live view and have that right there in real time, and not to mention autofocus systems, real time image histograms on your screen to judge your exposure instead of needing to use a little ambient or spot meter, raw capture. Uh, so even though you put all your images on a memory card, you can individually process them, which is exactly what Ansel liked to do with his medium and larger format film cameras, individual processing of each quote unquote negative. And then, of course, there's some tremendous high resolution and fantastic dynamic range, especially in those medium format digital cameras. Now, would it get you the detail of an 8x10 view camera? I don't know, but I think you'd be pretty happy with something like the Fuji GFX 100 cameras, these 100 megapixel things that are still fairly compact, interchangeable lenses. I think he would really like that kind of stuff. You're getting 12, 13 stops of dynamic range out of those cameras, way more than film. So if you've set up your camera, the idea is, you've chosen a format and you have a lens and you've chosen a focal length. You frame up your picture. The next piece of the equation in Ansel's philosophy was to get the exposure correct, and to do that, you had to use metering techniques. So I just want to briefly talk about this because Ansel created something called the zone system. Now we don't use that today, but essentially, the way that the entire reason for the zone system was to deal with getting an exposure on the negative that could preserve details and tones where he wanted them. So, for example, if he wanted an image to preserve bright tones, he would meter those bright tones and then he would say place them in what he would call maybe zone 7 or zone 8, where there's still going to be detail. Um, but the thing about the zone system was it not only was it a way to sort of, you know, visualize exposure, but it had everything to do complementary to the film emulsion that he was using. The system combined the exposure settings with the way he would develop and process the negative. So when he was shooting those larger formats, he could make notes and say, okay, when I was reading going through the books again, he would comment to say, I exposed this tone in zone 7. So that's slightly brighter than middle tone, zone 5 being middle toned. So keep it dark. But I pushed the exposure by a stop or so in the development process to make those tones brighter, but he exposed them so they were darker and still retained the detail on the piece of film. This is critical. The whole point of the zone system was to give Ansel Adams the best quality negative he could get, and the negative was never intended to represent his final output. Some people you may have seen contact prints from Ansel Adams negatives, and you look in his books, there might be some too. Um, they don't look anything like his final output, because the final output in film photography was always the print. It was never the negative. And we can learn something and apply that philosophy with digital photography. Now, I want to just show you something about digital cameras that's kind of interesting. This is a graph taken from a presentation an online class that I did a couple of years ago about modern digital exposure techniques. And there's a couple of techniques that you might have heard about. One is called exposing to the right, ETTR, and you've probably heard about things like bracketing, doing HDR things in post. The reason for these techniques is to try to deal with the fact that even though digital has a wide latitude, a lot of dynamic range, sometimes the dynamic range of the scene can still exceed what the camera can capture. And other times, even when we have all the dynamic range, we want to capture the best detail with the least amount of noise as possible. Now, this graph on the right side of the screen here shows you, based on a exposure value, if we were just to take the sensor and break it down to where the data is. So we've got EV on the bottom, 0 being middle tone, +1, +2, and then down to -4. The way a digital sensor captures data is not uniform. You would think that it would just divide up all of its little bits and divide those up equally across each part of the tone range. But the actual reality is that it has what's called a linear response. So if we look up here at the highlights +2 EV, fully half of the sensor data, all of those bits that are used to, the data points, are given to that most bright zone. And then each subsequent EV tone step gets half of the remaining. So we go from half, 50% to 25, and exponential decay. So by the time we're down in the shadows, we don't have very many data points at all to collect, to store information. Hence, when you pull your shadows, you start to see noise. So in today's exposure, we can talk about exposing to the right. And what that is simply placing your histogram so that the right edge is as far to the right as possible. And if you've got a mirrorless camera or you have a DSLR with live view, many of them will display a real-time histogram and it'll give you the look. Now, if you look at the meter reading from this wonderful picture of my living room, you can see my meter is actually set to +2 EV over. I'm overexposing from what the camera thinks should be the scene. And what the camera thinks should be the scene is, middle tone is middle tone. And it would be literally as though I were making a contact print. In other words, the camera just thinks you're shooting a JPEG and you want to hand it to somebody and have it look nice. If you're shooting in RAW and we're taking a more holistic and a more creative approach to the photography, we're trying to collect the best data in our raw image, not necessarily something that is the final output. So the live histogram gives you some insight as to where to place your exposure, and it also can tell you whether or not the dynamic range of the scene exceeds what your camera can capture. And if you see that in the field, you can say, hey, I might need to do some HDR bracketing here. So that's very cool. So the question that I saw in the chat box, is that the difference between metering and exposure? Kind of. Um, metering just reads the light. Exposure is the setting. And the meter is designed for, JPEGs, JPEG prints. It's designed to just say, hey, get it right. You can set the exposure to whatever you want. And then the idea is, in this particular case, if my image is a little bright, I'm going to fix it in post. Let me just show you the next slide for a side-by-side example. So on the left side here is the image that I took with that exposed to the right exposure. And this is what comes into, this is what it would look like. And if this was a JPEG, you would tell me it was overexposed and it wouldn't look good. But because I captured this in RAW and I had my histogram contained, all I had to do was move the exposure slider down a little bit, and it created the proper exposure. The reason I use the histogram for fine art landscape types of images is because it is unbiased. It is the tonal content of the entire frame. It's not biased by lights or darks. It just shows you where the tones are. So as long as I'm looking at my histogram in the field while I'm setting my exposure, I know I'm good. I'm not guessing as to I need to +2 or +1 or whatever. I just look at the histogram and I place it where I'd like to, um, by using exposure compensation or just manual exposure modes. Now, the final step is post-processing. In in terms of where this slots in with Ansel's books, we're kind of going between both what he would describe as processing the negative and the printing phase. We do that all in one component, which is called post-processing. So in Ansel's time, post-processing was two steps. It was how he developed his negatives based on his notes, and it was also how he made his prints through exposure times that he would calculate with test prints, and then dodging and burning to accentuate or diminish or bring back tones to localized regions. So with film, that's the print, that's the final output. We're talking about this holistic technique, starting with the camera moving to the exposed negative, developing that negative using particular darkroom settings, and then finally making a print. So we want to use our post-processing in this modern world to not only adjust exposure, tonal relationships, but something very important that Ansel would probably point out, which is to convey the feeling and the mood that you want to impart to that photograph. I think it was Ansel Adams who said, "You don't take a photograph, you make a photograph." And in his time, it made a little bit, it kind of sound made more sense if you think about all the darkroom work that you'd have to put in the hours of time. But we can still take that approach with our digital workflow. So here's that same shot that I had a few slides ago. On the left is the straight out of the camera based on my exposure with my histogram to the right. Basically, I pushed it as far to the right as I could get without blowing out those clouds. And then by using, in my case, Lightroom, I adjusted the exposure and then I darkened the sky to make it where I wanted, bring out the brightness of the foreground. What I did here in my computer is literally what Ansel describes doing with his dancing and dodging and burning and using his enlarger and the cards and the you know the and the burn the burn cards and the dodge wands and all the tools that he used in a dark room. And I talked about setting the mood. Here's another example: the before and after shots. This was in Rhode Island a couple of weeks ago, actually, and I love this boat. It was just this rusty thing. I was just absolutely, I don't even know how the thing was floating. It somehow receives a seaworthiness rating every year by the Coast Guard. Nevertheless, what did I want to make this about? I wanted to make it moody. I wanted to make the boat be the subject and draw attention to the rust coming out and just that texture. And I used processing to do that. Otherwise, I just give you the snapshot on the left out of the camera or the JPEG, and it's really not inspiring. It might be more true to reality, but what is reality when you're a photographer? It's about the mood and the feeling you want to impart to your audience. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we summarize this today is actually the very first chapter in Ansel Adams' first book, The Camera, and that's visualization. I left it to the end because I want it because it's so important, but it's what drives everything else that I've just been talking about in terms of the mechanisms and what we're doing. And here's a quote from that book. The term visualization refers to the entire emotional, mental process of creating a photograph. Okay. This is that feeling, the vibe that you get when you are out there and you're in nature or wherever, and you want to deliver that. Your camera, no matter how expensive it is, does not know what mood you're trying to create or what you're trying to deliver. And that is why we take these intermediate steps of things like processing. So visualization, it includes your camera and your lens. Are you using a wide angle lens? Do you want to have perspective? Do you want to push things back? Are you using a telephoto lens? Do you want to compress subjects? Do you want to have subject isolation through depth of field? It also is a little bit tricky because you're trying to visualize a three-dimensional scene or object in what's going to become a two-dimensional space when you finally make your photograph. You have to visualize the tones. You need to understand the exposure settings. That's the data capture process. In other words, you try to set up your camera so that you say, you know what, it's very important for me to get highlight, to capture the sky. I want to make sure that I capture this in a way that's going to not blow something out or clip shadows that are otherwise would go black where you want detail. And then lastly, put that mood and feeling into your shot by post processing and doing that. So I want to show this image. This is a famous photo from Ansel Adams. It's the Clearing Winter Storm, which he captured roughly 1937. And ironically, he doesn't really print this until 1973 or 74. Okay, and he went through a bunch of iterations and different prints to get it right. And this image is a complete composite of tones. Okay, so you have this sky which is dramatic, and you've got the waterfall. I mean, this is just, what this is why you go to Yosemite, honestly, right? But I want to put up what Ansel's description of just the scene and what he was visualizing when he went to capture this photograph. And he said, this is from his book, The Print, the subject was predominantly gray, but the emotional impact was quite strong. My visualization was rather dramatic. Hence, I gave reduced exposure. Now he's talking about his film camera, so he's dropping the exposure down to keep the sky from blowing out. Okay, and normal plus development. In other words, he pushed the exposure back up when he developed the negative itself. I used a Ratten #8 filter. That's a yellow filter, simply to reduce the slight atmospheric haze, but it did little to increase the basic contrast of the scene. So this is just his capture settings. He's going and he's seeing this and he's saying, well, this is the mood that I want. I mean, it's pretty flat and gray out here today, but boy, this would be dramatic if I make sure I capture this sky in the right way. So I'm going to use a filter, because again, a yellow filter would add contrast generally to skies to get those clouds. And I'm going to use this kind of exposure setting, and then I'm going to bump it back up when I develop this negative when I get back home. He goes on the following page to show a diagram of all of the dodging and burning that he did then to darken the sky, to hold back the foreground so it wasn't too dark, and all of the work that he did using literally just cardboard cutouts. Amazing that he could do this. So let's put it all together, and then I will be able to take some more questions at the end. And I'm going to just sort of summarize what we can learn. So if Ansel were here, I couldn't tell you what camera he was going to be using, but I'm pretty sure he'd be pretty darn happy with what you can do today with digital cameras. I'm just going to say that. For all I know, he might still like pulling out that 8x10 view camera once in a while. But if I learned something from these books and from this, from how he approached photography, it's that photography should be approached holistically as a end-to-end process. It's not just click the button and upload to social media. It's about making that photograph your own. Everything starts with your vision. That's the visualization step. Hey, that looks like it would be a fun picture to make, right? Let me go grab my camera. Set up your camera to frame the shot that you wish to get. That includes composition, but also the focus, depth of field, all of these settings. Do you want to use a slow shutter speed to capture motion? Do you want to use a fast shutter speed to freeze action? All of these things are important in settings for your camera. And then set the exposure in your camera to capture the best possible data set, and that's the raw exposure. That's your digital negative for that scene. And I use the histogram to judge it because again, the histogram is independent of the light meter. When you're setting exposure with a histogram, you don't even need to worry about what the meter says. You can just ignore it altogether. Now, again, that data set is going to be dependent on the subject. I'm going to set my camera very differently if I'm shooting wildlife than I am if I'm sitting up on a tripod shooting a landscape. So keep that in mind. Always capture photos in the raw format whenever possible if you want to be able to process them later. I'm pretty sure that's how Ansel would roll because that's how he wanted. That's why he liked shooting individual negatives. And then use your post-processing tools to render the final image the way that you visualized it. That's key. And revisit your images from time to time to look at them with new processing tools. You might be surprised. If there's something that's interesting about the legacy of Ansel Adams, if you look at his early prints from the 50s and when he was printing things, and then you look at those same images that he came back to later, and Moonrise is a classic example of this. He'll even tell you he refined it over the years and his images got darker and moodier and more contrasty and blacker skies as he printed later in life. So all of those things are absolutely a reminder to go back and look at some of your older images and see what you can do with them with today's new processing software, because you might be really impressed. Okay, that is the conclusion of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I'm Jason Odell, and I will see you very soon.